Welcome to week 3 of my week at the club, where I bring you my weekly game from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. My name is Roger Capello, and I'm a USCF candidate master. This week I played white on board number 1 in round number 4 of the Evert Siskonen Memorial. My opponent was Gary Brassard, whose rating hovers around 1800, and I knew this would be a difficult game. I'd prepared a line for him in the Sicilian that we played on many other occasions, and I've had pretty good results with it. So I was optimistic coming into the game, but he surprised me almost immediately in the game. So I opened with e4, and he responded with d6. Okay, this is the Pirt's defense, or called by many people the Perk, in which it's a hyper-modern defense in which black tries to chip away at white's center after yielding it. So I went ahead and played right down the main line with d4. He attacked my pawn and I defended it. This is all very standard theory, and I expected at this point for him to play g6. This is what I'd always seen before. But he surprised me. He didn't play g6. Instead, he played e5. And I basically thought this was a mistake. I'd never seen the move before. And it turns out that this is actually a pretty popular move now in opening theory. 25 years ago or so, when I did more work in the Perk defense, it wasn't. g6 was just the main line. But now this e5 line has gotten quite popular. And it's not the mistake that I thought it was. I figured, gee, it gives me a chance just to trade queens, put his keep his king captured in the center and stuck in the center, and allow me to gain time by developing my pieces. So I went ahead and swapped off the pawns and then swapped off the queens. And now he's, I thought, going to have trouble with me chipping away at his various weak points in his position. So I continued bishop to f4, like you do in similar sorts of positions, attacking this f7 pawn. And he surprised me by bishop to e6. And I said, well, how can he get away with this? This is going to give him doubled isolated pawns. I trade off the bishops, and he's got these two very weak e-pawns. And gee, this looks like almost a lost position for black straight out of the opening. But it turns out this is well known to theory. And in fact, we play a theoretical line up to move 13, even though it was all new territory for me. And this actually cost me quite a bit of time on the clock. So by move 13, I had used a third of my time. I was down to 69 minutes already by move 13 when we actually finally got out of theory. But I responded with a sensible move, or at least what I thought was a sensible move, bishop e3. This keeps his bishop off this diagonal, which would give him pressure against my f2 pawn, because I want a castle kingside. Okay, so he developed the bishop instead to d6. And then I took time out to play f3 to keep the knight from coming in and hassling my bishop and making it retreat. If he'd done it a move before, before I castle, I could simply retreat it and then attack his knight and force it to go back before I castle. But it's something that I have to prevent before I castle, so I do it now. He played a6, and this move is designed to prevent my knight incursion on b5, where I could come and attack his bishop and maybe get some pressure along this d file. Okay, I castled kingside, and now you can see how nice it would be if I could only put my knight on b5, but I can't. He plays king up, supporting his bishop even further and getting ready to connect his rooks, looking to complete his development. I played my knight to e2. Now this is not the best square for the knight. Instead, a better square is to go to h3, where at some point I might go through g5, attacking this weak pawn on e6. Of course, if I did it right now, it could just get pushed back by black then playing h6. Or possibly the knight might come through f2 and find greener pastures on the g4 square, for example. So there are various possibilities. Instead, I played it to e2, and now it's fairly restricted in terms of the squares that it can use, because d4 and f4 are both strongly under black script. So Gary continued with b5. This is expanding on the queen side, which makes sense since my king is over there, and it's also just grabbing some space. I put my king on a little more secure square, not so much to protect my king, because I wasn't really worried about the attack at this point since the queens have been traded off, but I wanted to use this c1 square for my knight. As you'll see, I maneuver it through there. He developed his knight on a reasonable square, and then I played my knight to c1 with an eye toward getting it eventually to b5. So I'm thinking about going either through b3 or d3 and getting up to b5. Okay, he takes time now to threaten expansion on the king side. And this is the first move that isn't in the opening books of Common Master Play. And the idea here, I think, is to attack my kingside pawn majority with his minority of pawns. It's a minority attack. And if I don't do anything to stop it, he could play g5 and then g4, and then actually exchange on f3, and then this f pawn becomes very weak on the open file. That's a typical idea with a minority attack. So I prevented it with h4, which I think is a reasonable move. And then he took time out to play knight to a4, which really has twofold purpose. It discourages me from going to b3 with my knight, but also has an eye on the c4 square for himself. Since I don't really want to trade off knights at this point, I play my knight through d3. Now I am threatening to play knight c5, which would be good. It's either a good square for my knight, or if he trades it off with the bishop, then it'll be a good square for my bishop. So it would be an advance in my position either way. He played knight c4, attacking this bishop, which is loose. And I have to put it somewhere. I think normally I would have tucked it away on c1, except that I was looking to support this c5 square. So instead of making that maneuver, I dropped it back along the same diagonal just to f2. Then Gary dropped his knight back to d7, which prevents me from immediately going into c5 because he defends that square twice and I only have it attacked twice. And if I move there, I'd simply lose the knight. So now I play my other knight, through e2 with the idea of going to c1 and b3, and then having enough pieces on c5 that I can, once again put a knight on c5. A lot of knight maneuvering in this somewhat closed position. Gary played rook to f8, which strikes me as a little bit vague. There's some pressure on my bishop, but right now it's defended. This pawn doesn't have to move, so it's not clear what this rook on f8 is accomplishing. So I continue with my plan of redistributing my knight over to the c5 square. Gary decides to put a stop to that by dropping his knight back to a5, and now I can't use the b3 square anymore without trading off the knight. Yeah, it might not be too bad. If I play knight b3, takes, this is a reasonable position for white. I have doubled pawns, but I get rid of this pesky knight that he has on the queen side, and it's playable. Perhaps one could argue it's better than what I did, which is to make my own vague rook move, rook to h3, with the idea that at some point this rank here, the third rank, might become open if this f-pawn moves and the rook can swing across, either doubling on the d file with my two rooks, or if that doesn't happen, there's also a possibility that my d rook here will play over to h1, and I could double on the h file, possibly after pushing the h pawn forward and trying to open up the h file for me to play on. So there are a few ideas with it, but it's not really forcing anything. Gary continued c5, which looks like a reasonable move, gaining more space on the queen side and threatening to drive my knight away from d3. Okay, at this point, I responded energetically with f4, and this is a mistake. The line that I analyzed, I actually spent quite a bit of time on this move. Let's see, after I made the move, I only had about 34 minutes left. So I spent close to 15 minutes on this move. And it was mainly looking at what happens after he wins my pawn. That is, the pawn on f4 is only defended once by my knight, and it's attacked 3 times by bishop, pawn, and rook. But it turns out that if he simply tries to take the pawn, that I have resources. In particular, what I was thinking might happen is that he would take the pawn, and I would push my e-pawn then, attacking his bishop. If his bishop moves away, then I can simply capture the c5 pawn in return. If he instead takes the pawn, say with the knight or the bishop for that matter, now he only has one defense of this c5 pawn. So I can, for example, trade the knights and then take the c5 pawn with check, and that skewer actually will win the exchange as his king moves out of the way and I win the rook. Blocking with the bishop doesn't work because I have that d6 square firmly under my grasp. Okay, so that's the line that I was looking at. It turns out that his best move after f4 is simply to play c4, and if I'd seen that, I wouldn't have played the move, because then the knight has to move away, and well, actually the knight can trade for the e-pawn, but it's not particularly good because black could exchange on this square and take again, and right now if both bishops are under attack, but he could simply win the pawn, and this is not a great position for, actually it is a good position for white. I just checked with the computer here while I was talking, and I do have bishop c5. So the mistake in this line is that right in this position, black shouldn't take that pawn, but instead he should just take on f2. And white could take the pawn on f6, and you know, black is doing okay. White's got an advantage of just about 1 pawn or so. But that didn't happen. Instead, back after f4, Gary played a third possibility, which I also didn't see, which was just to go back and simply defend this pawn on c5 one more time. And so these various ideas of after pawn takes pawn, pawn to e5 no longer work because I don't have that c5 square under control. So instead, I went ahead and exchanged pawns. He took back. I attacked that knight with my bishop, so now I was thinking that I might get some pressure along the d file after knight takes knight, which is what he did. But it turns out that when I got to this position, gee, it didn't look as good as I thought it might, because if I take the bishop on d6, check, he can simply recapture with his knight, and even though I get to double my rooks on the d file, he can defend the knight with his rook, and he's adequately defended. The knight, you know, is not pinned or anything because the rook is defended by the rook and by the other rook and the king. So there's you know, no special tactic going on. If I push the pawn, he could simply drop back or go forward for that matter. He doesn't even have to drop back with the knight. And this is not winning material for white like I had hoped. So instead, after he took on d3, I took with my knight on d3. He traded off bishops, and I took back. And then he made a blunder, really, playing rook to f7 in order to get his rook on g8 into the game, which is laudable. But there's a tactical problem here, and that's that I can attack it with my knight. And this looked very good for me, and it was, but not with the way that I followed it up. I didn't see the right continuation. Because what he did was to play rook to f4, and I hadn't really considered that. I thought he might play rook to f2, which is quite bad really for black, because I can simply go up after this move. After he plays that, I can simply check with my rook. His king has to move to the back rank. If he comes out with the king, like so, to f6, then I could check him with the knight, and the king has to move, and then I win his knight. So that's obviously no good. So instead, he has to go to the back rank, and in this position, I can almost win his knight. Of course, it would be a mistake to do that immediately. If I take the knight immediately, then there's a checkmate on the back rank. So I realized that coming into this, and the plan in such a position would be to push the pawn up to make Luft on b2, and now his knight is not going to be captured immediately, but it turns out that it can't easily get away. So it can go to d8 is really the only, well, it has two squares actually. From here, it could go either to a5 or d8. Either one is no good. If he goes to d8, then I can simply double rooks on the d file, attacking the knight a second time. He has nowhere to go with it that is safe, except for f7, and if he does that, then I simply go up. I trade the knights first, to block off the f7 square with his rook, and then check on the 8th rank and win this rook that's back behind the king. The point being that the king can't go to, when I check him, he can't go to f7 and guard the rook through the sequence, because the knight ends up blocking that square off. So instead of doing that good move, I played b3, and b3 doesn't work as well. It's still an advantage for white, but it would have been much better if I'd played the rook to d7 immediately, because he takes my pawn now, and so I really am a pawn down. He's attacking my knight, I'm attacking his, and we can trade knights, which is what happened. And if I do so, I take his with check. He moves his king, and then when I take the knight, and he takes my knight in return, now he's a pawn up, but I have pressure. I have the rook on the 7th rank. His king is pinned on the 8th rank, and I'm looking like I might be able to win the g pawn or do some other bad things. And at this point, Gary offered a draw, and I would have been smart to take it because I had 10 minutes on my clock. He had 30 minutes on his clock, so it was a very strategic draw offer. But I said to myself, heck, I'm better in this position. I'm down a pawn, and I'm down on the clock. But boy, with that kind of pressure, with my rooks and his king pinned down on the back rank, there's got to be something good in this position. And in reality, there is. After rook to f3, then it turns out that white has enough of a bind on the position that he ends up regaining his material and still having a better, more active position than white has. And it's about a pawn advantage, according to Stockfish. But that's not what I did. Instead, I checked him, which is quite a bad mistake, because the king comes out, and I had thought when I refused the draw offer that, well, if I check him and he comes out, I can always check him again and repeat the position. Well, no, it doesn't quite work that way, because he can run out to f6 with this king, and now he's in danger of holding on to that pawn. I have to work a bit more to secure an advantage. And what I played was rook to d6, thinking that I would activate that rook. But it turns out that this rook and pawn endgame is not so great for white. It would have been better just to go after the weak a pawn instead, with my rook back in this position to play rook a7 and pick up that pawn. But instead, I didn't do that. I went to the d file, And now he started playing this rook and pawn endgame quite well, and I made a number of mistakes, admittedly in time pressure, but that was, of course, of my own doing, getting myself into time pressure like that. So he got his pawns moving on the queen side and opened up a file toward my king by playing c4. I exchanged pawns, and now after a check, which really doesn't do much very useful for white, he simply blocks, and I didn't want to change rooks at this point. I played my rook back to attack his weak pawn. This is a mistake on white's part because this just simply allows him to force an exchange of a pair of rooks. And in this position where I have a serious bind on the position with my two active rooks, trading down just to a single rook simplifies his task. I can't do nearly as much damage with one rook, and his pawn advantage is going to start coming to the front here. So he didn't hesitate at all. He played rook b5 and immediately forced the exchange of rooks. And also, while he was at it, repaired his isolated pawns on the queen side, which is another nice added benefit. So the position now is starting to get somewhat critical for white. And unfortunately, with the time I had, I couldn't find the necessary moves to put pressure on his position, even though his rook is temporarily out of play. I checked his king, drove it back. It could have come forward. Attacked the g-pawn, thinking that I'd pin his rook down at least. But this maneuver doesn't really work because he played the pawn up to g6, and I attacked the pin pawn, but he simply bypassed it by advancing it. And now there's really nothing there anymore for me, and he's threatening to push his h pawn here to h6 and defend that pawn. I shifted over here thinking that I would, maybe keep his e pawn from advancing anymore. But he correctly sees that me playing rook e5 is not a threat, because if I do, for example, he can just play his rook to d5, and that defends both of these pawns that I was forking, and I can't afford to trade off rooks, because this will be a totally lost king and pawn endgame. Rook and pawn endgames, a pawn up, they're often a draw. King and pawn endgames, a pawn up, are generally a win for the side with the pawn advantage. So I didn't go in for that line. Instead, I activated my king, which is okay. He went ahead and moved his rook forward. I decided to come over and try to hassle his king with some checks from the side, but as you'll see, it doesn't really accomplish too much. He advances his pawn. I checked him. He dropped the rook back to defend along that second rank. Otherwise, I win this h pawn over here. Again, I can't afford to trade the pawns off. I was hoping that I could trade off the rooks and run my king over to win this e pawn, but of course he's in time to defend. He's closer to the e pawn than my king is. So I dropped to the 6th rank, where I thought I could maybe he would be tempted to play rook d6, and we could get a perpetual, just going back and forth like so. But he wasn't interested in that. When I got to the 6th rank, he correctly assessed that it was time to push the e pawn further, because when I go over and attack his h pawn, he can simply get out of the way of the rook defending that pawn. And again, maybe he should have gone forward with his king at this point, but this seems to work okay. And when I tried to get behind the e pawn to stop it from advancing, he can very simply put his rook on the file, and once again I have to avoid the rook trade. I go over and check. This is probably a bad check. I should have instead gone immediately and attack the b pawn like so, rook b6, but of course he can defend it, and after his king comes to b7, that's not going to help me much. Although maybe here I could play rook b7 and attack the h pawn. At least it's a little more active than the check that I made, because this just drives his king out to where it not only attacks my rook, but it also defends his b6 pawn, and his b6 square where my rook wanted to go. So it's time for me to stop the e-pawn. If I get too crazy going around trying to grab pawns, I'm not going to be able to stop it. I drop back. This king came up, and this is sort of the level at which I was analyzing at this point in the game, because I was down literally to less than a minute from the remaining moves in the game, and was having to blitz my moves out pretty fast at this point. Gary, however, still had a decent amount of time, probably about 25 minutes, and was able to think about each of his moves and made accurate responses. I came up with my king. He came up with his. I played the rook over, hoping to stop the pawn from going any further, but he pushed it, and now notice my king is cut off from using the d file here, because his pawns cover d2 and d3, and so my king cannot go over to blockade the pawn, which is what I'd like to do. I pushed my pawn to stop his pawn, but it's really too little too late. He came over and attacked it. I made his job a lot easier, although the game is totally lost at this point, by allowing him now to trade off the rooks. Guy snapped his e-pawn off, but he gets my a-pawn check. I have to move the king, and he trades the rooks off, and now this is just utterly lost because of these two pawns on the queen side. Will keep my king from going away from the queen side, and then he can just bring his king over to the king side and leisurely and win my pawns, which is what he just does. So he advances the b pawn, which is the correct move. I drop back with my king. There's little else to do at this point, and he took a little time out to strengthen his pawn. He probably didn't have to do that, but what am I going to do? I'm just marking time with my king, and now his king starts coming over to the king side, and I can go with it for a while, but if I go any further, then, for example, if I play king here, now I'm out of the square of this pawn, and there's this box formed by the b3, d3, d1, b1 square. If I can't step into it, my king is not in time to catch up, and even if I try to come back, there's no way to catch up to this pawn, and he would just simply get a queen. So in light of that, at this point, when Gary played king f4, I resigned. So it was a good game by him. He played well. I mean, there was the mistake and when he allowed his rook to come under fire, but he followed it up well enough, and I didn't find the correct continuation in the ensuing difficulties at this point in the game where I had played knight e5, attacking his rook. I just didn't find that correct continuation to actually then come up with my rook into his position like I should have, and cause a bind on his king by playing the rook up immediately, and then taking time out for making luft over here for my king. So slight inaccuracy, and it ended up being the difference between a fairly easily won game in the middle game versus one that was kind of a pawn down struggle in the end game, which I just didn't have the time resources to manage. So can't win them all. I had hoped to win that and go on to play the final round on first board next week, but instead it looks like I'll be probably on board 3, and I'll be fighting to get into second place for the tournament, since next week is the last round, the 5th round. So until then, this is Roger Capello. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.